Hi, I'm Thinks Too Much, and today we're going to be taking a look at Eternal Darkness, one of the GameCube's more obscure and less appreciated titles that thankfully has gathered a cult following over time. Let's take a closer look. Undervalued, underappreciated, and underrated are words those who play Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, will use to describe this unique horror title. As one of the few rated M for mature games for Nintendo's GameCube during its war against the original Xbox and PlayStation 2, it's easy to see why many people chose to pass on this hidden gem. The GameCube had a reputation for being a kid-friendly console for most of its lifespan, and with the exception of Resident Evil 4, many games aimed for adults didn't really gain much traction with Nintendo's little lunchbox. That's a shame because Eternal Darkness is one of those games that isn't only enjoyable, but tries new and innovative ideas that may have caught on to the rest of the gaming world if Eternal Darkness got a little more commercial success. But those who were lucky enough to play this title when it first came out understood what made it so unique. While Eternal Darkness is a horror title, it isn't a survival horror game. It's a psychological horror game. You'll have the means to defend yourself against any monstrosities you see, but the scares don't come in what you can see, but rather in what you can't see, and the huge, looming dread that hovers over you the deeper you get into the game's story. Taking huge inspiration from classic horror literature by authors such as Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft, Eternal Darkness ingeniously translates the feeling of paranoia and helplessness from the stories of these classic authors into the world of gaming. But besides literature, Eternal Darkness also uses the obscure art form of the macabre to provide unsettling and disturbing imagery that, while frightening, is also strangely beautiful, even for a game made in 2002. It takes an extremely rare game with passionate developers to bring the best of literature, the best of an obscure art form, and the best of gaming mechanics all into one amazing video game title. But before you start the game, Eternal Darkness opens up with a passage from Edgar Allan Poe's classic horror poem, The Raven.
Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting.
At first glance, this passage looks like it was just tackled on for artistic flair. However, the more you play, the more you realize that Eternal Darkness takes its inspiration of literature very seriously. The story follows the main character, Alexandra Roivas, aka Alex, as she investigates the sudden and gruesome murder of her grandfather, Edward Roivas. With no clues to his murder, Alex investigates her grandfather's mansion to see if she can discover who or what is responsible for his death. Her investigation leads her to a family secret filled with dark magic and the threat of human extinction at the hands of all-powerful beings called the Ancients. The story itself might be cliched, but it's the manner in which Eternal Darkness tells its story that makes it really unique. Early into her investigation, Alex stumbles on the Tome of Eternal Darkness, an unholy book made of human bone and skin, which allows you to cast spells and literally live the lives of people who had been fighting the Ancients long before Alex's time. The story is told through a span of millennia, and you'll play a wide range of characters, from a Cambodian dancer in the 15th century to a World War I journalist and even a Roman centurion named Pius Augustus who serves as the story's main antagonist when he is turned into a skeletal-like creature after being corrupted by the Ancients' magic. These changes in characters keep the story engaging, all while connecting the events back to Alex and her grandfather's murder. In total, you play as 12 different characters, and in keeping with the grim nature of Eternal Darkness' story, many of the characters face gruesome ends. The fact that not all the heroes fighting against the Ancients will make it out of their adventure alive shows that Silicon Knights, the developers of Eternal Darkness, aren't afraid to step power away from the player, but doing it in a way that is different from games such as Resident Evil. Usually, having this many characters in one story can make it feel disjointed, but video games have the advantage of time, unlike movies and music, and Eternal Darkness takes its time in telling a gripping story. Out of the dozen characters, you can count on one hand the number of them who make it out of their adventure alive, and even if they do, they leave with mental scars due to the horrors they are forced to witness. It's a clear homage to the works of Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft, where even those that survive have to live with the horrifying images of what they saw.
He's wearing our family ring.
The dangers you face in Eternal Darkness are cleverly implemented with the game's infamous sanity meter. Every character you play has a sanity meter, which measures how mentally stable your character is. It gets lower the more you witness horrifying events. If a zombie looks at you, you'll lose a little sanity. If a monster pops out of a human body, you'll lose a lot of sanity. You can regain your sanity by casting recovery spells from the Tome of Eternal Darkness, once you learn them, or by finishing off enemies once you wound them. But if you let your sanity meter reach low levels, you'll start to see and hear things that aren't really there. This is where the inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's literature really shines. When your sanity is low, your character might start to mumble incoherently and act paranoid, scaring themselves with things that aren't really there. Some of the characters you control even commit heinous crimes as they delve deeper into their madness once you finish their part of the story. Many of Edgar Allan Poe's classic stories follow characters that go through a similar sort of psychological down spiral towards madness, as his horror comes more from the emotions of his characters, such as grief or guilt, and how those feelings manifest into great but invisible fears. In his classic horror poem, The Raven, the nameless narrator is grieving over the death of his lover, Lenore. The death of Alex's grandfather in Eternal Darkness could be a subtle homage to that part of The Raven. Delving deeper into his grief, the narrator in The Raven starts to feel terrified by the simplest of things, such as curtains moving through the air or knocks on the door that aren't really happening. The sanity meter scares the player in similar ways. It starts to make noises that have no origin and sometimes moves things that shouldn't move at all. When the titular raven makes its appearance in Edgar Allan Poe's poem, the narrator first finds it funny that the only thing the bird can say is, "Nevermore." However, as his grief continues, the raven keeps repeating the same word, "Nevermore, nevermore, nevermore." And the narrator starts to see the bird as an evil omen, telling him that he is damned never to see his lost love Lenore, going as far as to even argue with the animal as if it were a real person. The poem ends with the narrator feeling trapped in the raven's shadow as some sort of dark symbolism of his never-ending grief. The reader is left to conclude that either the narrator has gone mad with grief, or the raven is indeed a thing of evil. A similar sort of symbolism is seen in Eternal Darkness, as the shadow of the ancients is always looming over humanity and its extinction, with only some people being chosen to defend against it. Many literature critics have discussed back and forth whether The Raven is a story of an evil omen or just some guy going mad with grief. Eternal Darkness combines both interpretations of the Raven into its story, because even if your character is going nuts over something that isn't immediately there, you know the ancients are somewhere, plotting to engulf the universe into eternal darkness. The game also uses imagery and wordplay that are inspired in the Cthulhu mythos made famous by H.P. Lovecraft. If Edgar Allan Poe's horror is emotional, then H.P. Lovecraft's horror is that of the unknown. It is no surprise that many H.P. Lovecraft stories take place in literally huge settings where the fear of the unknown can be played with. Areas such as the vast size of the sea, or the unexplored and unmerciful cold of the Antarctic, are places in which Lovecraft uses huge space to drive home the fear of the unknown. It should come as no surprise that many horror games, including Eternal Darkness, use big mansions as their setting. After all, what is more intriguing than a huge house holding dark secrets that are waiting to be discovered? Big mansions might be a horror cliche, but they are effective in bringing in the mystery, which dovetails great with horror. In the first level of the game, you have a choice as to which of the three ancients will be the story's main threat to humanity. Ulyaoth is the ancient who focuses on magic and dimensional planes, Xel'lotath focuses on the mind and insanity, and Cthulhu focuses on physical strength and matter. The names of these three ancients could have been swapped for the names of the creatures in H.P. Lovecraft's stories, and I don't think people would have known the difference. Their actual physical appearance is more original design in part of Eternal Darkness than inspiration from H.P. Lovecraft, but these three ancients don't fully appear until the end of the game, so it doesn't really make a difference. However, there is a fourth ancient, Mantarok, which is the only ancient the player actually interacts with during gameplay. Mantarok was the ancient that kept all the other ancients in check, as he banished them to different realms of reality so they wouldn't be a threat to humanity. But regardless which alignment you choose, Pius cast a spell on Mantarok and now its power weakens as the centuries go by. Physically, Mantarok is fantastic Lovecraft design. It has many similarities to the creature known as a Shoggoth or Shoggoth that was first introduced in Lovecraft's now classic story at the Mountains of Madness. In Lovecraft's novella, a Shoggoth is described as a massive amoeboid-like creature with various eyes, mouth, pustules, undefined appendages, and no defined shape. Mantarok fits this description to a T, and he is even described by one of the characters the same way he is described in Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, albeit in a more condensed way to fit with the narrative of the game. Mantarok might be a good ancient, but you never really know what the next character is going to have to suffer through to stop the other ancients from wiping out humanity. And if Lovecraft stories have taught us anything, is that godlike creatures are not to be trusted. Another source of inspiration that Eternal Darkness takes from H.P. Lovecraft is his creation of the Necronomicon, which is a book that almost always has to do with the supernatural. The Necronomicon was popularized by movies such as the Evil Dead series, and for many of us, this is how we were introduced to this fictional book. But it was first created in H.P. Lovecraft's 1924 short story, The Hound, and ever since its first introduction, the Necronomicon has taken on a life of its own. The Necronomicon has become so popular to the horror genre in general that many authors have referenced the Necronomicon in their works, and H.P. Lovecraft was nice enough to approve of its use in their works when he was still alive. The fascination for this morbid book comes because it is usually portrayed as evil or holding forbidden knowledge that cannot and should not be comprehended by a mere human. Media such as movies portray the physical look of the book as being covered in leathery human skin, though Lovecraft's original physical look was just that of a normal book. So the fear came from what was inside the book rather than playing on aesthetics. In Lovecraft's original version, the Necronomicon itself was written by Abdul al-Khared, also known in his stories as the Mad Arab, who has become another horror cliche as the crazy person who was right all along. His book contained information about the Old Ones, a race of primordial godlike beings that existed long before man arrived on Earth, and how the reader could summon them for their own benefit. The Ancients in Eternal Darkness are an obvious homage to the Old Ones that Lovecraft created. The original Necronomicon wasn't really a book of good nor evil, but it was powerful and served as a warning for those foolish enough to think they could control the power it held. Again, playing on the idea of forbidden knowledge and power. Many of these things might seem cliche today, but back in 1924, when H.P. Lovecraft first wrote The Hound, the idea of a power too great for anyone to control was fresh and frightening. After all, a neutral power can be just as destructive as an evil power because it's entrusted in whoever is using it, and history has taught us that humans are corruptible beings. As mentioned earlier, I would recommend seeing the Evil Dead series, both the original trilogy and the 2013 reboot. Not only are these movies awesome, but they give the Necronomicon a more modern update if you find Lovecraft's original design a little boring. Eternal Darkness uses the Tome of Eternal Darkness as its version of the Necronomicon, and it walks a fine line between using the modern physical look while still respecting H.P. Lovecraft's original vision. Like in Evil Dead, the book is a morbid and even macabre-like creation. It is bound in human skin and bone and has the power to cast spells, summon the ancients, and live the lives of the previous characters who held it. But like H.P. Lovecraft's original vision, the Tome of Eternal Darkness isn't necessarily a book of good nor evil. Instead, how its power is used depends on whoever holds it. The Tome of Eternal Darkness becomes a powerful weapon with spells you discover on your adventure that help against Pius Augustus and the many enemies the player encounters in their adventure. This interpretation of the Necronomicon is unique to the video game medium because its ideas and mechanics can only be expressed as a game. The interactivity that the Tome of Eternal Darkness has allows the player to experience a version of the Necronomicon that can't be replicated in books or movies. But literature was not the only inspiration Silicon Knights had while making Eternal Darkness. The art of the macabre is a somewhat obscure form of art that is used to great effect in Eternal Darkness. To people not familiar with this real-life art form, it can seem gruesome, ghastly, disgusting, and even horrifying. But there is a strange beauty in the macabre for those willing to take a closer look. In many ways, the art of H.R. Geiger can be seen as a macabre art form, even if his art deals more with sexual expressions. The macabre emphasizes the gruesome imagery of death in paintings, sculptures, and sometimes even using human bone as a means to make detailed works of art. It might seem morbid, but the macabre is still a strangely beautiful form of art, even for those who don't get it. In the real world, a famous example of this art is the Sedlec Usuary in the Czech Republic. I hope I'm saying that right. The Sedlec Usuary is a Catholic chapel, but it's decorated with human bones. From the chandelier made entirely out of human bones to human skulls lying against the wall in precise and detailed manner, it is estimated that the bones of at least 40,000 people are used as decor for the Sedlec Usuary. It wouldn't be surprising if the developers of Eternal Darkness let their imaginations run wild when being inspired by this form of art. There is imagery of the macabre everywhere in this game, especially when the insanity effects kick in. Paintings start to change into demonic yet artistic skeletal-like forms when your insanity starts to get low, and as you go through different time periods with different characters, the game's environment change and use the art of the macabre to create the sense of dread and that time has passed. Even if your sanity meter is full, the setting sends you warnings that you're in a place that no human should be. Murals, sculptures, and even the monsters you fight against have macabre-like designs to make a playthrough tense. There are even original macabre-like creations in Eternal Darkness, with the Tome of Eternal Darkness itself being a macabre-like creation, seeing as how it's made out of human bones and skin. The monsters you face might not seem too different from your cliched affair you have seen in other games, mainly due to graphical limitations of the GameCube, but Eternal Darkness does at least give detailed and haunting descriptions of each creature through an autopsy entry in the pause menu. This autopsy entrance is narrated by one of the game's characters, Maximilian Roivas, who is voiced by William Hootkins. If that name sounds familiar, it is because he is the actor who played the fan favorite Porkins in the first Star Wars movie. But besides Star Wars, Mr. Hootkins also had roles in famous movies such as Raiders of the Lost Ark and the 1989 Batman movie. In a time when voice acting was just starting to be given importance as an effective way of storytelling, Eternal Darkness spared no expense in the voice actors they hired to bring to life its cast of characters. The main antagonist, Pius Augustus, is voiced by Richard Doyle, who has a number of TV, film, and even cartoon roles under his belt. His performance as a corrupted Pius Augustus makes the character feel evil and unmerciful, especially when he kills many of the characters you control. The main protagonist, Alexander Roivas, is voiced by Jennifer Hale, who is now one of the most recognized voice actresses in gaming and in cartoons. Her portrayal of a young Alex Roivas growing braver as the story progresses is spot on. When the story starts, you feel Alex's vulnerability as her grandfather is murdered, but as the story reaches its final stages, she becomes headstrong and prepared to fight in the final battle against Pius Augustus in what is a very imaginative and well-made final boss battle. But William Hootkins definitely steals the show as Maximilian Roivas. William Hootkins delivers each of his lines with the talent that can only come from experience he has earned in the film industry. Maximilian Roivas starts his part of the story calm and collected, but by the end he goes completely insane due to the monstrosities he has seen in his battle to defeat the Ancients. William Hootkins plays his descent into madness so well that I wouldn't be surprised if he studied some of Edgar Allan Poe's literature to prepare for the role. Maximilian's descriptions of the monsters in the pause menu of the game are so haunting that they feel like something pulled straight out of Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Telltale Heart. This short story once again follows a nameless narrator into his descent into madness as he tries to convince the reader he is not insane by describing how he almost pulled off the perfect murder. Long story short, whether by guilt or madness, the narrator in The Telltale Heart thinks he starts to hear the beating heart of the man he just murdered, and while he successfully convinces police that the man is out of town, the sound of the beating heart is just too much, and the narrator confesses to murdering the man and pulls out the floorboards where he buried him. Unfortunately, William Hootkins passed away in 2005, but will always have his work, like his role in Eternal Darkness, to prove that the right voice actor can make all the difference in engaging the player in a bleak yet immersing universe like Eternal Darkness. While the game did not meet the commercial success it deserved at first, In time, Eternal Darkness gathered a cult following that shows inspiration from literature and art can be modified into an unforgettable gaming experience. Not to mention that art and talented voice work can go a long way in immersing players into a terrifying world. Rumors of a sequel have been circling for years, but it's highly unlikely that one will come out at this point, mainly because the series' director, Dennis Dyack, has turned into somewhat of a tool in the years following the release of Eternal Darkness. But regardless of whether a sequel comes out, Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, is still an exceptional horror title that comes up with ingenious ways to scare the player by adding classic literature and art without getting in the way of actual gameplay mechanics. If you're lucky enough to find this title in a retro store, I highly suggest you pick it up. The only thing that might seem dated are the graphics, but even then, they actually help make the game scarier thanks to the game's art style. Just be prepared for a title that brings its own ideas and inspirations to a horror genre that could learn a thing or two from Eternal Darkness, even for today's standards. Thank you for watching.